exploring minds through insightful conversation. This is the Ian Scotto Podcast.
Ian Scotto here for the third edition of the Ian Scotto Podcast. I'm here with Rick Ungar, and I'll tell you about him in a little bit. But so far, we've had two podcasts, completely different. The first one was Brandon Webb, Navy SEAL sniper. Second with Intrinsic, who's a rapper from Arizona. I think we're going with a completely different, style of guest every time.
Boy, is that the truth. I mean,
Yeah.
You've had a Navy SEAL and a rapper, and now you're stuck with me?
Exactly.
You've got some serious booking
All
problems,
over
and
the
you're
place.
already only in your third show.
Yeah, we're going all. Anybody I find intriguing, anybody I like to talk to, and
Those guys are intriguing.
And on it, from the moment that I met you, working here at Sirius and doing all different types of stuff, I was like, this is a very interesting guy. So just from your background with everything. So I will say who Rick Ungar is, but before we even get into what Rick Ungar's done, it's been an insane news week. So Rick is a contributor for Forbes. You're a regular on Fox, not a Fox News contributor, though, right?
No, I am actually a Fox News contributor.
You are? Okay.
Yeah, I have a regular show, so it's a bit odd on Saturday mornings on Forbes on
with
Fox.
Forbes.
Yeah.
Who's a great guy who I've met here before.
Steve's
too.
a terrific guy.
And because I know they're very weird with who's a contributor and who's not a contributor.
I know, it's very confusing even to me.
Yeah. So you've all that, and then also the creator of Biker Mice from Mars, which
and you should probably highlight, having said that I write at Forbes and I'm a contributor at Fox News, I'm a token lefty at all of these places.
Exactly.
I'm not what you might expect me to be on these media outlets.
But I think I don't know as much about if you're the only guy to the left on Forbes.
No, I'm not.
Because at Fox, I would say, I think people who don't really watch the station that closely have this idea in their head that every single person at the station is this far-right winger, and that everybody on the station is Sean Hannity or Bill O'Reilly, which it's not like that.
No, it's funny. The perceptions of Fox are fascinating, and listen, I have a lot of friends who just can't believe that I would go on Fox. But I'll tell you what, I mean, for starters, the reason I do that is because, what's the fun of sitting in a studio and talking with people who agree with everything that you say?
But I also think
it's profoundly boring.
If you were on MSNBC, I don't think you would be in agreement with those guys either.
That's an interesting point. I'd certainly be in more agreement with them, I suspect, more of the time.
Sure.
But no, I wouldn't consistently be, at least I hope not. It means I'm not thinking. But, I watch too much of this stuff, and I see people going, yes, that's right, and yes, that's right, and I just go, God, that's dull. And I've been on those places.
Sure.
I actually do a lot of work at Current because I just like the people there. But there is a lot of
cheerleading,
agreeing,
and
it's just not as much fun as getting to talk with people who you don't agree with. The big secret, though, at Fox is, I have to tell you, they are some of the nicest people I have met in my life.
And I've heard you say that.
It's true, and it drives my progressive friends nuts, but you know what? It's just true. These are some really nice people I know there.
Sure. And I want to get into all that, and we will. But we have to first talk
after this commercial message.
That this has been an absolute
you haven't sold any commercials. Oops.
No, this is just me and you for an hour talking on the podcast. But
oh my God!
But before we even get into all that stuff about what you're up to, your life story, even this week has been.
I was born in a log cabin in a small Ohio town.
This week has been absolutely insane, though, in terms of news.
Isn't that the truth?
And when I say that, people probably think I'm only talking about this Boston Marathon bombing, but I mean beyond that. Yeah. There was the CISPA bill passed for the which is going to give the government more power to tap into the internet.
Right.
Beyond that, you also have the explosion in Texas, which killed more people than
Absolutely,
this bombing.
Yes.
And
I don't think we even know yet how many people were killed in that thing.
And a ton of injuries. Have you seen the video?
It's awful. It's just awful.
The video of the guy who's about a mile away just filming in his car, and all of a sudden, I mean, it looks like it's from a movie.
They said that the blast was felt 70 miles away with the intensity of a 2.2 Richter scale earthquake.
Which is
That's
insane.
Extraordinary.
It's insane.
Extraordinary. Horrible. Just horrible.
I watching the video, it was just hard to believe what I was seeing. So you have all that. Also, the ricin letters, which were sent to various members of Congress.
Yeah.
I
I
believe.
didn't find that all that upsetting because it turned out it wasn't particularly lethal,
Yeah.
and we know who did it, and he's a mentally imbalanced guy. He's not a terrorist. He's not.
But
He's a guy who needs help.
I think it was.
And by the way, none of those people were ever in any danger. The only one who might have been in danger are the poor folks who work at these post office outposts
Sure.
who go through this mail before it ever gets near a senator or a president. So
But
you worry about them.
I think it scared the public a lot because it was even reminiscent of after 9/11, the anthrax letters, and people automatically started saying, "Is this connected?"
Except
to
it
the
wasn't connected
Boston
after
bombing?
9/11.
No, that wasn't either.
So-
But remember, people thought it
Yeah,
was.
yeah.
And now after these Boston bombings, people automatically assumed, all right, did he
Right.
make these presidential?
I
the
actually
president.
didn't. I never made that assumption because probably of 9/11.
Sure.
Listen, people get silly ideas in their head when something gets this much attention. And my first thought is, oh, this is some dumbo who got a silly idea in their head and decided they would try and pile on. They don't understand. It's never going to get near the person that they want to target.
Yeah.
It may do damage to some poor person who works for the post office who's going to have to open that letter. But it's never going to affect the president. It's never going to affect a senator, which just reveals them to be morons, not
Sure.
even quasi-terrorists.
That's crazy. But the bombing itself, I have to say, the reaction by the media, both on the left and the right,
God-awful.
I thought was horrible. And it
Horrible.
was just the same way I felt about Sandy Hook. Everybody was running to politicize this. And it wasn't just a reaction of, I feel like you no longer see in the country the reaction we saw after 9/11 where the country just comes together and says, let's put politics aside. And what a terrible story this is. It was the left, I think, really hoping this guy was a white supremacist so they could say, see, this NRA member or something. And then you had people on the right praying that it wasn't that and that it wasn't Islamic
Right.
extremists so they could, because it would make them look bad.
Yeah, it's it's remarkable. I don't want to overstate it. It wasn't a lot of people. It was some people, and some people who I watched were trying to be careful, but ended up tripping over their own tongue. There was a lot of that. My judgment as a columnist was just to keep my mouth shut.
Sure.
But it's a fascinating thing. Look, just because you may not write about it or talk about it, we all had an instinctive reaction to what we thought might be the case. Some people voiced that unwisely, or others kept it to themselves. But there was a great lesson in this, and that I hope people are paying attention to. Look, I will now disclose, now that we know something about this,
Yeah.
my first reaction, and not because I come at the world from the left or any other reason, but you put two and two together in your head and you go, oh my gosh, it's tax day. It's April 15th. This could be somebody who's got a problem with taxes. It's Patriot Day in Boston.
Sure.
It's the anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombings. You put all these together in your head, and you start to. And by the way, that never led me to a conclusion. Oh, this is some right-wing party.
And you didn't
thing.
write a column.
Good heavens, no.
Or even a tweet.
To me, my guessing in my head was this is an extremist. Not, I didn't leap to the Tea Party. You know that I know a lot of Tea Partiers who I love dearly, who
Sure.
I'm very close with. I didn't leap to any of those conclusions, but my initial thought was, boy, this is likely to be somebody who's got a big problem with taxes and is trying to make a statement, et cetera, et cetera. The lesson in this is we don't know yet why these two guys did what they did, but you know what we do know? They weren't what that conclusion would have led you to.
Exactly. And
So
they also
therefore,
weren't.
if I had voiced that thought, no matter how rational it may have seemed to me or to somebody else, I would have been wrong.
Exactly.
Or
And-
maybe I would. Maybe it's going to turn out that was their objection. Just because they came from another country doesn't mean they couldn't think that.
But also when we say came from a different country, they
Right.
came from a different country at the age of, I believe,
When they were
7.
little kids,
So
exactly.
this isn't a foreign
Exactly,
attack. It
exactly.
really is domestic. It
Well,
really is from the
it is.
inside, whether they're Muslim or
That's
not.
right. That's exactly right.
They were raised here, so.
And I don't know if they were both naturalized American citizens. I know the one that's alive still.
And we don't know how
And
far
we
the
also,
religious
by the way,
motivation
don't yet
is.
know if they did it. We
there's
believe
there's
what
a
we
lot of
believe.
evidence,
There
so.
is, but you know what? It's not evidence until it's presented in court.
Sure.
Now, we all have our opinion. You have an opinion, I have an opinion. We probably both have the same opinion. There's a lot of things that we've heard that would lead us to a certain conclusion. But you know what? We've just heard it.
But even beyond that politicizing, I was watching Bill O'Reilly, I believe, either the night of or the night
Yes.
after. he did an entire segment, and I'm, a more conservative libertarian guy, but I have no problem attacking my side, even though I don't necessarily see Bill O'Reilly on my side. He did a whole segment saying that the president should not have called this a tragedy. What do you want the president to call it?
Yeah, I thought that was really, and he wasn't the only one. I thought that was very ill-advised. Look, even somebody like Ari Fleischer, who I don't often find myself in agreement with, went on television right after the president's speech, and he said exactly the right thing, because that's what he would have told as the press secretary George Bush to do. Listen,
but the problem is this attacking of
whether
it's the president or anyone just before you even hear the story.
Exactly.
It's that you have to. So that's when there really is outrage over a story like Benghazi. I think the public turns away because they're so used to hearing outrage over nothing.
Right.
The president called it a tragedy, and I don't know what the outrage was about.
I agree.
It doesn't make any sense to me.
I don't care who the president is. I don't care what party the president comes from. When the president says something, it takes on enormous weight.
Sure.
For the president to have prejudged what this might have been about would have been insane. It would have been wrong. It would have been just sheer folly.
Of course.
So why anybody would attack him for doing so, I just found it really shocking,
I just think it's this
and it
media,
wasn't just Bill O'Reilly.
Of course,
There
but there's
were
this
others.
media problem, I think, at whole of just insensitivity after these things. After Sandy Hook, I could say I was disgusted at the interviewing of these children. There was no reason to interview children immediately after they saw a fatal shooting like that.
I agree with that. And by the way, I'll go you one better. People think that those of us who might have some left leanings always support the president. I'll tell you a little story. You remember the morning we woke up and the NRA had put that ad up on the web involving the president's two daughters.
Sure.
Do you recall that? They basically said, sure, he wants gun control.
You're saying about
his daughters are protected by all these people with guns.
I know what you're saying, because they were calling for armed guards at all schools.
Yeah,
which, by the way,
yeah.
Even though I usually am in agreement with the NRA, would be completely unconstitutional to have at the federal level.
I think would also be stupid, but that's a separate question.
Okay.
But I was very offended by that ad, and I then thought about it. I thought, gee, the president's supposed to be having this big event today, and if I remember correctly, he's planning to have little kids up on the stage behind him. That strikes me as a bad idea, considering that we're all beating up the NRA this morning for exploiting his kids. So I called the White House. I called my contact at the White House, and I said, you guys have this thing planned? Yeah, we do. I said, and you're planning to have kids on the stage? He said, yeah. I said, are you still? He goes, well, yeah, why wouldn't we? I said, because we've all been beating the crap out of the NRA this morning for exploiting children. Why would you turn around 4 hours later and do the identical thing? You don't need to have those kids up there. We get it.
Yeah.
Why would you do that? And they thought I was crazy. And they went ahead and they put those kids on the stage.
There's no consistency on both sides. And I do agree. Children should be a line.
Exactly.
You don't need to bring them in. I even remember and we're getting into a whole lot of other stuff, and we will get into
It's inevitable.
But I even remember during the presidential election, I think it was on Think Progress, where this woman had her son ask Rick Perry, why are you anti-science? Why, and I don't think you should use your kid as a mouthpiece for that.
I agree.
So,
let them be kids.
Yeah. So I think you and I are in agreement that the media really just did not do a great job handling this.
With some exceptions. Listen, I think the whole world's recognized Pete Williams over at NBC. Awesome. And for my liberal friends, by the way, you should know that Pete Williams worked in a Republican administration.
Sure.
So this is not about politics. The man just did a really good job covering the story.
And then beyond the left and the right, everybody automatically now jumps to conspiracy theory, which we were talking about before, which is also crazy.
It just makes for print, but of course it's ridiculous. Nobody knows anything.
Sure. But it happens
hopefully
with
the
everything.
FBI knows some
with
things, but
Sandy
we
Hook,
don't.
it was immediately conspiracy theory. And with this, I really don't get this obsession with it. Nothing is ever the way it seems. There could never be these troubled people who go into a crowd, into a marathon of all places with bombs and try to kill people.
Well, listen, I've been listening carefully, obviously, to what some of the psychiatrists are saying about these two boys, and I'm just keeping it to myself. You know why? Because I don't know anything. I don't know any more than anybody else knows.
Exactly, and you want to just report the facts.
So I say, hopefully the police know a lot more than I do. Hopefully the FBI knows a lot more than I do. And you know what? That's where it should be right now. I don't need to know it yet.
I am in entire agreement with you. Well, okay. So anyway, moving on to what I've wanted to talk about, and what how I would have started 2 weeks prior when I booked you on here. So you're a guy who, as you said, writes for the left on Forbes.com. Also,
I won't say I write. I don't write for the left. I
Not
write from the left.
From the left, I should say, on Forbes.com, and also a regular on Fox News and a Fox News contributor. You originally started, I found out when we had a conversation back here, that you were the creator of a cartoon series during the 90s called Biker Mice from Mars.
Absolutely true.
How did that come about?
I can't tell you the true story about how they came about. Well, look, I mean, I started my career in the entertainment business, but actually as an attorney. I was an entertainment lawyer. Did that for a number of years and started to come to the conclusion that I was a pretty good writer, and my clients were having all the fun. So, occasionally I would have an idea, and I'd go to the very same people that I used to go to on behalf of my clients and say, hey, I got an idea. Let me tell you this idea. And they would politely listen because they didn't want to tick me off because they knew they'd have to negotiate with me for one of my clients.
Sure.
And then they'd look at me and they'd go, Rick, you're a lawyer. Get out of here. They wouldn't take any creative ideas seriously. And that really kind of bugged me. People don't realize it, but a good lawyer is a good writer. The two are extremely, extremely simpatico. They go together. So I just kind of started doing it anyhow. And Biker Mice came about actually from a Sunday morning brunch at a Jewish deli in the Valley out in L.A. My wife and I were having breakfast with some friends of ours, and in roars into the parking lot a motorcycle gang. And my first thought is, what's a motorcycle gang doing at this Jewish deli?
Sure. They
take off their helmets, and they're yuppies. They're doctors. They're lawyers. You can see, I'm like, well, that's kind of interesting. So the next day I called a friend of mine over at Mattel Toys. I said, what was the last big motorcycle toy? He says, I don't know. I'll get back to you. He calls me back. He says, it was Evel Knievel's stunt cycle. I said, how did it sell? He said, huge. Now, that makes sense. Little boys really dig motorcycles.
Of course.
So I was starting to think, okay, what would be now? At that time, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were huge, right? I mean,
absolutely.
Not just the cartoons, but you couldn't go anywhere without seeing merchandise.
I was born in 1986, so
right.
Of course I grew up on the Ninja Turtles.
So,
and everybody had the figures.
You had the figures, the T-shirts, the bed sheets, right, everything. So, and that's what interested me, of course. So the following weekend, I was actually up at our mountain house in Lake Arrowhead, California, and just thinking about this stuff. And it was like, well, they can't be green. They can't be turtles. So I don't know. I was thinking biker.
So are you saying you ripped off the idea from the Ninja Turtles?
Well, no,
and
although my friends who created the Turtles like to say I ripped off the Turtles, but no, of course I didn't. I was following a genre that was popular. There were any number of shows at that time that were in the genre. And by the way, the Turtles were certainly not the first to use what we call animatronic animals as living, talking things. So we all rip off each other. We all ripped off Walt Disney. Sure. Mickey Mouse talked, So it was really more trying to come up with the alliteration, and I liked the sound of biker mice. And then from there, so I had the title before I had the show. It was Biker Mice, and I thought, well, Biker Mice what? Biker Mice from Mars. So it began with the title and went from there, and it went pretty darn far.
So you originally, though, because you said you worked for, people who were representing all these types of shows. You originally said cartoon show.
Well, I mean, I actually did some legal work for people in that area, but I was representing actors, writers, all sorts of things. I just liked that business. I understood the financial upside of having a successful animated show. You do a successful primetime show, let's say a sitcom or something. You can do well, but one of the smartest people I ever knew once said to me, the only way you get rich is if you're making money while you're sleeping. And I was keenly aware that while I was going to bed at night, there was somebody on the other side of the world buying a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle action figure.
Yeah.
Right? And they were making money. So I just loved that idea. So that was, I make no bones of the fact that the generation was to sell merchandise. So
definitely.
that was really how I got there.
And it was not that there were a ton of shows that were similar at the time. I even remember Toxic Crusaders.
That's right.
Which it's the funniest
Lloyd
thing
Kaufman,
about
friend of mine.
who I've met Lloyd as well, and he's one of the funniest people I've ever
hysterical.
met. Because I originally worked for Fangoria Radio going into radio, so I got to know him very well. But the funny thing about that cartoon was, I mean, it was based off the movie, which was completely adult.
Exactly.
I mean, pornographic to some extent, and they managed to make a children's show out of it. So there was that, and then there was also that Sharks cartoon, which
Yes.
what was it called again?
Street Sharks.
Street Sharks, and a lot of these were similar from the vein of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And
Street Sharks was actually produced and distributed by my friend Alan Bobot, who I still work with from time to time.
So you guys were all
We all knew each other. Sure.
Communicate with
It's
each
a very
other.
small world.
Was there ever any talk of like a Biker Mice from Mars movie or anything?
Yes,
more than
actually
that?
there was, and there was again recently. In fact, I wrote a script for a movie way back in the day.
And it just didn't happen.
Just didn't happen. No,
Would have been cool to say.
would have been, and it actually came up again recently because there's this whole, people are like interested in that era again.
Of course. Oh, it's just, anything vintage. I think nowadays, like even with music, a lot of bands are coming back, and I think there's just something that people love about the '80s, the '90s. It was a great era growing up.
As
during
I
it.
say, bring the check, you can have the rights.
Yeah, I would definitely watch some new.
Although
Biker
I won't
Mice
be,
from
I
Mars.
won't be writing it this time.
Okay. So how did you make the transition then from that to what you're doing now as a writer?
Well, there was
a columnist?
a lot in between, obviously.
Yeah, it was the year because this was during what 1996 or so.
Yeah, and I stayed in that. Well, actually, no. Biker Mice began on television in 1990, I think one.
Oh, all right. I thought it was
no,
later on.
it was earlier. And then actually, the company that paid for it, produced it, New World Entertainment. I ended up running that company, and we sold that company to Fox, as it happens.
Oh wow.
In '97, and then in 98 or 99, Marvel had undergone. Actually, it gets very complex, very complicated. New
I'd love to hear.
World was actually associated with Marvel. Had the same owner, a financier named Ronald Perlman, owned both Marvel and New World. So even when I was at New World, I was involved with Marvel characters because we had the Marvel Studios there. So I was doing Marvel stuff back in that era. Then when we sold New World, I took a little time off, and then Marvel had a new owner. It had gone through a bankruptcy, and my friend Avi Arad, who produces the Spider-Man movies today, Avi and Ike Perlmutter had purchased Marvel, and they kind of enticed me to come back. So I ended up back at Marvel, where I stayed for quite some time. I was president of the characters division and was writing and producing again. In animation. So, but I had goodness. If you ever watch Access Hollywood, I put that on the air. So I had,
wow.
I had
was
all
unaware
these
of as well.
experiences in television before
Yeah.
I got near this sort of thing.
So how did the I mean, it's a huge transition to make from entertainment, and especially from children's cartoon to writing about the serious issues of the day as you do now.
It happened in 1997. To try and make a long story short, I had to have heart surgery in 97. And when I was in the hospital, I met a guy, older guy, 75 years old, who had just had a heart transplant. I actually met him, when you have heart surgery, they get you out of bed really quick and they want you to walk. So they come to get me. I mean, the day I'm up from the intensive care, and I looked at them like they were crazy. I couldn't get out of bed, man. I couldn't even breathe. And they literally lifted me out of bed, take me down to the end of the hall, and they buddied you up. I was like 47 years old, and there's all these old guys. They pair me up with this old guy who's got a cane, and we start walking down the hall, and he's getting out ahead of me.
Wow.
And I got ticked off. I said, hey, if you don't slow the bleep down, I'm going to kick that cane out from under you. He started laughing. So he and I became friends. It was his story. This guy was 75. He had done everything he was supposed to do, always had a job, always worked hard, but was underinsured. And because he had had congenital heart problems his whole life, this guy was financially ruined. And I just thought, that's wrong. This is not a bum. This is not a guy who didn't want to go out and work. This is a guy who did everything we ask of you. And here he was bankrupt because of the way our health care system was built. And it ticked me off. And that was what really got my interest going in the American healthcare system. Studied it for years. And that's really what led me into the world I'm in now, was really my expertise in healthcare.
And you're more than just a healthcare writer.
I am now,
though.
yeah.
So
I began that way, though.
So it originally was just you were writing about the issue of healthcare.
Yeah, actually, you know who I first wrote for, believe it or not? Bill Bennett's online magazine.
Okay, who's to the right as well.
Yeah, exactly.
How come you're always
I don't
in the
know.
presence of these guys who are on the right?
You know, I was on the phone yesterday. I don't know if you know who Vin Weber is. Vin was a 10-year congressman, Republican.
Okay.
He founded Empower America with Jack Kemp. He is one of the true bright conservatives in this country. Today, he is a principal in Mercury Public Affairs and is really one of the top lobbyists in Washington. I do some work with Mercury, and Vin and I were on the phone yesterday, and I said, you know what my problem is, Vin? I like Republicans. I don't know why, but I get along with them. You were laughing.
Well, I think that one thing that sets you apart and just certain people who are in politics apart, and from when I met you, is that a lot of the time I feel like, because I've met so many people in this arena just working in the area of politics, that when the microphones are off and they're not doing the interviews, they do not want to talk politics, and they don't even like to have a debate with anybody not on their side. And there's too much divisiveness, and that people just like to talk to people who are like them. They don't want to be challenged with their thoughts by people on the opposite side. And you kind of welcomed that the moment that I met you coming in here, and you enjoy debating and discussing issues with people who aren't of the same thoughts.
There's two issues there. First, if you're not prepared to discuss these issues with people who disagree with you, you're never going to learn anything.
Of course.
That's number one, because you actually assume that you have all the answers.
And you get locked into this ideology without hearing from anybody else who disagrees.
I've yet to meet the human being who has all the answers. And my take has always been, at the moment I die, if I was right 51% of the time, I win. But that means I was wrong 49% of the time. That's just real life. The other part of it, which is critical, is you never pick your friends by their politics.
No,
you're going to miss out on a lot of nice people.
And also a lot of people, quite frankly, who you might agree with 100% of the time on issues.
Can be total jerks.
Exactly.
Absolutely. I can tell you some, believe me.
No, definitely. And it has to do with who you get along with and who you're able to just discuss issues rationally with. That's kind of funny that you're always in the presence of these guys who are on the opposite side. But the healthcare issue that you mentioned, actually, I mean, it's a heart-touching story. And I think anybody could relate hearing a story like that. But does that mean that you think the government has to be involved fully in healthcare to solve a problem like that?
I think at the end of the day, it's not even about what I think. It's more about what I perceive as the reality. At the end of the day, whether you like the idea of government single-payer healthcare or whether you detest the idea of government single-payer healthcare, guess what we're going to have? Government
I don't know if I agree
healthcare.
that we're ever going to go that far.
There's just no other way. There's no other way to do it.
I think one of the major issues that I've always seen, and it would be a simple solution, not to all problems, but it would fix some things. Why are we not allowed to buy health care across state lines? Why can't someone in New York, why can't I here buy a plan in Kentucky that works for me and would be cheaper?
I can tell you the why, but more important than the why is the reality of what it would mean. Let's start with the why. The why is simple. Every state, because of the way our law works, every state's entitled to set their own rules when it comes to issues like health care.
Sure.
So if we're in New York and the legislators we elect in New York have decided that they want X, Y, and Z for the citizens of New York, Kentucky may have a different, and typically does have a different set of rules. But that to me is what I call the MacGuffin. That's the misleading issue. I couldn't care less if people buy health insurance from anywhere. Here's why it doesn't solve the problem. Health insurance rates are not set based on what state the company comes from. They're set on the data and the metrics of where you live. If healthcare is more expensive in Bloomington, Indiana, than it is in Paducah, Kentucky, that company may come from Kentucky, but guess what? They're going to charge you based on what it costs in Bloomington, Indiana. It is a total false argument. So I've always said, go for it, man. Buy your health insurance anywhere you like. It's totally okay with me. If you think it's going to save you a cent, you're totally kidding. The only place where it might save you, if Kentucky pays the people their overhead costs at an insurance company, for some reason a little bit less than they pay in New York, then you're going to save a few pennies theoretically because their overhead's slightly lower. But that's not the real cost of health care. Your insurance rate is structured based on where you are likely to call upon, the insurance company to pay for what you're getting.
But don't you think there needs to just be more competition in general? Isn't that part of the problem that you can only
No.
choose from a certain amount of healthcare providers in your state.
It's not. I wish it was. I truly do. I really do. This would all be so simple if you could resolve this by what they call the consumer-driven model. I'd be all for it. I truly would. No, it doesn't make it any better because no matter how much competition it is. Look, here's what people misunderstand about healthcare insurance. These insurance companies make a fortune, but you know what? They operate on tiny, tiny margins, anywhere from 2% at the low end as a rule to 4% at the high end. So there's not a lot of room for an insurance company to cut you a better break because there's more competition in the market. They're all working on these really slim margins. So in reality, no, you're really not likely to get a better deal whether you're going to 5 insurers in your state or 50 insurers because there are just certain realities to the market. Each one of them still has to pay a doctor what they have to pay a doctor. They got to pay a hospital what they got to pay a hospital. The only place where they can cut you a break is if maybe they're more efficient in how they operate their business. And then you might save a little money one to the other. But it is not going to be the solution. The other problem is on the provider side. Doctors got to eat too. They do.
Sure. Exactly. Well, that's a huge argument against single payer, I would think.
And no, because don't presume that single payer means that doctors are going to get paid less. It doesn't. Here's the other problem with the consumer-driven models. Much as I would like to believe it could work, when you go out to buy a TV set, what do?
You go out and you choose whatever works best for you.
You go shopping, right? Yeah. You look for a best price because you want to save some money. So let's say you go out there and you really want that new 3D TV. Man, you are into getting that TV. You go to every store you know of, you go online, and you conclude the following. It's just too expensive. And I know the price is going to be lower next year. You're going to be bummed out because you really want it, but you'll wait.
Sure.
You'll wait. Or you may go, I can't wait for a new TV because my buddy put his foot through the one that I have and it no longer exists. So instead of buying the 3D, I'm going to have to buy something else that I'm going to like, but not as much. That's consumerism, right? You go shopping for the best deal. Now, you wake up tomorrow morning clutching your chest because you are in severe pain. Your wife
can't wait the next year. I know what you're saying.
Your wife calls the ambulance, takes you to the hospital. You're having a heart attack. Are you going to go shopping for the cheapest doctor at that moment to do your bypass? Or is your wife going to be on the phone calling everybody you know saying, who is the best open heart surgeon in New York? Because you ain't worrying about the money. You're worrying about surviving.
Of course. No,
it's not consumer driven. You don't
I entirely see the point in there.
best.
But the biggest problem I see with the single payer is where's the incentive to have a healthy lifestyle if we're all being covered the same, we're all going to have the same health care provider.
It is.
Unless the government is going to dictate that we can't smoke cigarettes, we can't, eat unhealthy, we have to work out a certain amount of hours a day. Why should someone who lives a healthy lifestyle have the same insurance as someone who has no care whatsoever for their health?
First of all, you shouldn't presume that would be the case, although your point is absolutely fair. There are a lot of places where that will come into play. Doesn't necessarily mean, by the way, single payer does not necessarily mean that if you smoke and I don't, that we're going to pay the same thing, or that because I'm older than you,
single
I'm
payer
going to pay
also
more.
mean if you're unemployed, you're going to be on insurance just like someone who is employed?
Yes.
So they don't have the money to pay any more than someone who is employed.
Well, no, they're not going to pay more. That's right. I mean, it becomes a right as opposed to a privilege in essence.
So at that same time, you do have a right as an American to smoke however many packs of cigarettes you want a day.
Yeah.
Do we as a society, the taxpayer, have a responsibility to cover that person?
Well, it's a very fair question. But I would argue, at the end of the day, you kind of do. Just by the same way that the Constitution gives us certain rights, we have a response to bring it to something a little bit far afield. And I'll come back to your actual point.
Sure.
We have an obligation to give this guy who we think is a really, really, really bad guy certain protections under the Constitution.
Under the Constitution as it is now.
We have an obligation to do it.
You would have to change the entire Constitution,
Here's a fascinating issue.
Healthcare.
You're right. You're absolutely right, because the Constitution doesn't make it a right. But keep this in mind. We are the only industrialized nation in the world where owning a gun is a right, but healthcare is a privilege.
And that's what sets us apart
from
every
other
societies.
One, it's the opposite. But
that doesn't mean we're wrong. That's
I understand.
The way our
I'm not saying
society
we are.
is.
But now go back to the point, though. The reason you'll end up with single payer, And all the points you're raising are absolutely fair. I wouldn't sit here and argue for a moment that it's perfect.
Sure.
It isn't. Nothing in life is perfect, I find. It will be the only way we're going to be able to find a way to deliver health care. It's just going to be the only way. Because you raised the issue of an unemployed person. Being unemployed does not necessarily mean you're a bum. I've been unemployed at times in my life.
And I'm not saying that it does.
Of course you're not. But yet you can't afford health insurance. Do we really think that because you are unemployed right now, looking for a job every minute of the day, if God forbid your kid gets cancer, that your kid shouldn't be treated?
I don't think anyone would argue that. But
but then I got to stop.
But then
you.
what type of health care are they getting?
Wait.
They're getting the same health care as everybody else. And is really no one going to be above in the system? You don't think politicians will be able to
wait.
To evade that system?
I can't let you skip over that point. If you agree that nobody wants that, it's not about chemotherapy is chemotherapy. There's not better chemotherapy or worse chemotherapy. It's chemotherapy. So it's not a question of, rich people who have earned their money should have the really good chemotherapy. And do we really want to give that to the unemployed kid's daughter and the guys?
But are there enough doctors to perform chemotherapy on all of them?
I'm sure. And what if there aren't, by the way?
Then a lot of doctors are probably going to leave the field, and we're going to end up having people who aren't qualified to be doctors become doctors.
No, they aren't. Tell me what a doctor's going to do if the doctor leaves. Do you know doctors? You have any doctors in your family?
Not in my family,
okay,
no.
But you know doctors.
Sure.
Can you envision that doctor doing anything else in this world but being a doctor?
Well, there's also, as you said, there's also an incentive of what they make. I mean, they go through all those years of school, and it's not just to be a good person.
I agree, but
people.
let's stick on the point though. You said doctors will leave. This is to me another big MacGuffin. For better or for worse, once you're a doctor, you've put those years in. You may have made a mistake. You may have thought that your mother told you were going to be God. You were going to be a billionaire, and so you became a doctor. Whether your mother was right or wrong, you're a doctor today. You tell me what most doctors are trained to do. I don't know too many doctors who I would call phenomenal businessmen. I don't know any doctors, and I know a lot of them, who I would call great salesmen. What exactly are they going to go do? They all go, well, I'm going to stop practicing medicine. Great. What are you going to do next? Still got to support your family, too.
So you think that there's not going to be anybody who leaves if they start making less in the field?
I really don't. I'm not going to say anybody. There's always somebody. But no, this mass exodus.
But here's
people, where you
become
do
a doctor. It's
where
all these
are
years
they going to do?
Go back to school as they did to become a doctor.
Sure they are.
And get a completely different license.
They're 45 years old. They've got a family to support. And they're going to go back to school.
If they have the money to afford it from all their years of practicing, it's very likely.
And what are they going to become?
Something else of their choosing.
It's just not real life.
There's a lot of doctors who are not on board with Obamacare because they know they're going to make a lot less. And plus, Obamacare, I might as well say, is not single payer.
No, it's
a
not
completely
single
different
payer.
thing.
But it doesn't matter.
Are you for the model that we're going to have now under Obamacare, as opposed to
let's finish this conversation,
sure.
Then we'll go to that. What you're saying is, I'm 62 years old now. Let's pretend I'm 10 years younger. It's like me waking up and deciding this doesn't work for me anymore. I'm going to go back to school.
You have done that. You created Biker Mice from Mars, and then you became a political commentator.
That's because I was capable of doing it. But
if
I wasn't
capable of other things,
I wasn't going to go back to school to become an astronaut. It wasn't going to happen at 52 years old.
There's no one stopping you.
Yeah, there was. 52 years old, I was. It's just not real life. I'm not telling you nobody is going to do it. There's never a nobody. But this now here's where you have a fair point. I'm going to tell you what to focus it on. It's not that doctors are going to quit practicing medicine. It's that with this huge influx of people now who are going to be able to get medical care,
there's going to be way more.
There's not going to be enough doctors. That's a fair point.
And because of that, a lot of less qualified people are going to be elevated to the status of doctor.
Actually, well, how's that happen?
Because if you need more doctors to give all these people care under a single payer model, you're gonna need more doctors, and there might not be enough. Because if you need more people, there's not going to be as large of a qualified pool to pick from.
Who says that?
I know there's only a certain amount of doctors in the country.
Yeah, you're right. So you're going to have more people going to medical school, but that's not even the true solution. You know what the true solution will be? I'll tell you a story. I'm a diabetic. Right, like I said, I know a lot of doctors.
Sure.
I'm a diabetic. When I was first diagnosed, I was living in L.A., and my doctor says, you're testing positive as a diabetic. I'm going to send you to Dr. Susan Peters. I go, who's Dr. Susan Peters? She is it. She is the head of this stuff at USC. Big name, very famous. That's, my doctor wouldn't send me anywhere but the best, right? I go, okay, I'll go to Dr. Peters. I make an appointment. I go down there. I wait like everybody else, and I get called into a room. There's a woman in there, and it took me about 45 minutes before I realized this wasn't Dr. Peters. It was the physician's assistant. That was 11 years ago. Do you know I've never met Dr. Peters? I never want to meet Dr. Peters, because if I have to meet Dr. Peters, it means that my typical run-of-the-mill, everyday diabetes has become something else that I don't want it to become. This physician's assistant has taken phenomenal care of me. That's going to be the answer.
But that doesn't mean that physician's assistant is able to do what Dr. Peters is doing.
Sure she is. She's able to do what needs to be done. Most people who come to Dr. Peters' office, only need the services of the physician's assistant because we're all pretty boring.
If you bring all these new people into a pool and have to cover them all under health care, plus, which adds to the immigration issue, you're going to have to cover all of those people if we have something like amnesty. There are not going to be enough doctors to cover everybody.
It's going to be a problem for a while. There's no question. But let me ask you this. You're not married yet, are you?
No.
Okay. Try and envision yourself married with a kid, right? And imagine you're going to be very successful, but pretend something goes wrong. And your kid, God forbid, gets seriously ill. Are you seriously?
But you're making an issue, a sympathetic
issue.
Don't
you want your kid to get care? It's real.
Of course, everybody would want their kid to get care.
So you worried about there not being enough doctors? Or you worried about your kid getting care?
Well, you have to worry about both. You can't just.
At the moment,
I don't want there to be unqualified doctors.
I understand that, but at the moment, God forbid, your kid gets sick. Are you really going to be worrying about the politics and the policy of Obamacare?
No, but I will be worried if the doctor, operating on my kid is qualified to do the job that they're
Of course you will.
doing.
But you're not. It's an unrealistic expectation. Nobody's going to be licensing doctors to operate on anybody who aren't qualified to do it. You're presuming that only those who have become doctors are qualified to do so. It's just wrong.
You don't think there's going to be a lower standard?
No, I honestly don't.
I think there would be.
As a matter of fact, there's some statistics that would surprise you, because we've seen this already. This is not a new issue. We've had a huge influx of foreign doctors coming into the country because the doctor shortage is nothing new. There was huge concern when that started that, hey, who are these people we're letting in? As Americans, we have this tendency to believe that we are more competent than the rest of the world.
I'm not even saying that, but I know what you mean.
I know you're not, but we do tend to do that, including me, by the way. I'm no better than anybody else in this regard.
Sure.
And yet, as they've done the research into this, these doctors have raised the level of competency in medicine, it turns out, not lowered the level of competency.
And that's believable, because I could say that there's been a lot of stories coming out. I saw that there was, in Mexico, I think, the first double amputee, the first double arm amputee. Right. They put two prosthetic arms on this person that are completely working.
Right.
And it was surprising that the first operation of that sort was in Mexico.
Why is that
over
surprising?
Here. Well, because as you said to some of us, you do think that of us being the best.
I know.
And I get what you're saying with that. So, are you happy with the Obamacare model that's going to take place as opposed? I know it's not going to be, if you're a single payer advocate, it's not what you're going for entirely. But do you think it's going to work better than what we have now?
I think it's better than what we had. I think it's a step along the way. I also think it's not anywhere near as big of a deal as we all made it out to be. We turned this into this great big political thing. At the end of the day, there are some cost issues. This is where people have a legitimate concern. There are some cost issues, and we don't know. So much of Obamacare, this is what never gets discussed, so much of it is experimental.
Which is a problem, though, because it was a bill that none of us could read.
But there was no other. Well, I read it. I read it tons of times.
You did not read the entire Obamacare bill.
I've read the entire Obamacare bill 7 times now.
How many pages
Start
is it?
to finish, 2,000-something.
You read that entire bill?
7 times.
All right. Well, that's pretty impressive. Well, you're one of the few, then, because very few
it's
people...
It's not easy. That's why I read it 7 times.
But even the people who voted on the bill didn't read it.
No, they didn't. You're right. And Nancy Pelosi said the dumbest thing I've ever heard a politician say. No question.
Yeah, we need to read the bill.
Pass it and read the bill after.
To find out what's in it.
It was unbelievable. But look, there's no other way to do it but experimentally. All of these things that are in the bill that are designed to cut costs, we don't know if it'll work or not, but you still have to try these things to find out. My guess, some of them are going to work, and we're seeing some early signs of it. Some of them are not going to work. That's reality. You know what else is going to happen? Unintended consequences, going both ways. Some of the things that we thought were going to be great are going to go, oh my God, we never thought of that. That's a big problem. And some of the things we hardly thought about at all are going to turn out to be the savior. This is the way legislation always works. accidental benefits, accidental detriments. But at its heart, what Obamacare really did was stop some of the worst abuses of the private insurance model. And there were some terrible things happening that can't happen quite as easily anymore. And I don't even know anybody who complains about that. It did get rid of this whole problem of not being able to get insurance if you have a pre-existing condition. To somebody like me, I've got many. I mean, I'd be uninsurable, truly, if it weren't for the fact that I live in states where, I can have a company, have my wife included in there, and pay an ungodly amount of money that I can afford to have health insurance. You don't want to know what I pay.
Sure.
I promise you, I pay more in health insurance than you earn a year. I do.
But
I really do.
You're not covered by just Fox News across the street?
No, I don't. No, because I'm an independent contractor. I pay for it myself.
Okay.
And it's really expensive. I will benefit from Obamacare because while you unfortunately will not, it's true. As a younger person, you are going to pay more.
I would under it right now, actually, because I'm not insured by the company I work at.
Right,
so
right.
I would technically.
But
that doesn't mean I'm for it just because something
No,
would
I understand
benefit
that,
me.
but this is something that people miss. Younger people are going to pay a higher premium than they would have before Obamacare. It's true. Older people like me who haven't reached Medicare yet, I'm going to pay less.
Sure.
I'm going to pay less. So it's good for me. Someday you'll benefit from that because someday you're going to be older. Guess what? I know it doesn't seem like it, but it's going to happen. So there are a lot of these things that there are pluses, there are minuses. The thing has been so torn apart in how it's been presented to the public. And by the way, I blame the Obama administration for a lot of this. Their communications effort was pure crap. They just did a terrible job in explaining it. There are going to be things that work. There are going to be things that don't work. This is legislation. Any complicated piece of legislation is going to have that problem. The reality, though, is we've got to get Congress into a place where instead of this ideological battle over a piece of law that it's on the books, deal with it. Now let's focus on finding out what turns out to be good and what turns out to be bad. If it's bad, get rid of it. Nothing ever said that you couldn't make changes to this along the way. In fact,
Sure.
You're supposed to. And if it's good, double down on that. Sure. But the politics of it has become so obscene that I don't know that we're ever going to get that chance.
This is once again the Ian Scotto podcast. If you're flipping around, between what we're talking about, I'm once again with Rick Ungar, who's a Fox News contributor, writer for Forbes.com, the creator of Bikermeister Mars, and I also found out the only person I know who's ever read the Obamacare legislation
7 times.
So to move on to some different things, because we actually are starting to run out of time here, believe it or not, because this is going great. You wrote a recent piece I just saw. The most recent piece you did was about Lindsey Graham, who, from what I read, is starting an attack basically on the Muslim community because of this recent bombing. You're saying I'm misinterpreting that.
No. What he said last night through a series of Twitters, I don't want to paint him unfairly. He suggested that this one guy, the other one's dead.
Should not be read their Miranda rights.
Well,
he
said
be
that
given
he
a
should
trial,
be treated as an enemy combatant.
which would mean we wouldn't give them a trial.
Yeah, well, let me make the distinctions for you. An enemy combatant, he gets a trial, but in a military tribunal, not in a civil court of law. An enemy combatant is entitled to no rights under the Constitution, no due process.
Wouldn't that make him the same as Anwar al-Awlaki, who we dropped a drone on his head?
Different issue.
American citizen.
Yes, different issue though.
Sure.
We can get to that next. We should cover this first.
Of course.
So
I'm
it's
just
clear.
wondering if it would be the same.
Well, no, and Anwar al-Awlaki, first of all, was not in the United States. We
true.
dropped a bomb in his head in a foreign country. So that right there makes a distinction. Also, I mean, that's a fascinating case. You can make great arguments in his case on both sides. You really
Sure.
can. I actually came down on the side of thinking we did the right thing. So
Really? I wouldn't.
I did. I know. And I get why people don't. I do. I don't think
and to
they're
the people
crazy.
listening who think it's always the
It'd be the opposite.
I think
Yeah.
I would be the more anti-war guy
Yeah.
on the right than you on this one, Rick.
See, here's why. Well, we'll go with that. Listen, basically any American, let me paint it this way. Actually, let's use the example of the first brother who got blown away the other night, right? Our obligation to him was that we do everything possible to arrest him and bring him in alive. But we don't have an obligation, or the police don't have an obligation, to sit there and be killed in the process of doing that. If the guy is trying to kill them, which from what we're told he certainly was, they have every right.
Under an imminent threat, of course.
Exactly. Well, I look at Al-Awlaki, and I believe he very much wanted to kill my granddaughter. Right?
But he didn't. He wasn't an imminent threat. If we didn't kill him right then and there, it's not like he would have killed people.
Well, actually, I'm not sure I agree with that from what I know. But more importantly, we could not bring him to justice. We couldn't do it. If there was any way to capture this guy, I'd say you capture this guy. He's an American. But I wasn't comfortable with the idea of knowing that we couldn't possibly capture him. And so because of that, we were going to be prepared to let him do his thing and send over another underpants bomber and do all that stuff because we couldn't capture him. There's a distinction there. The difference between that and somebody in the United States is we can capture anybody in America. So we may not have yet, but we can.
Going back to the Lindsey Graham issue, though, so what would he suggest that we do with this guy as what he would label an enemy combatant?
Well, as an enemy combatant, he would never be entitled to Miranda rights, which means he has no entitlement to a lawyer. He has no right to remain silent. He can stay silent. You can't, unless you torture him, you can't force him to talk. But when the difference is that under Miranda rights, if you're not read those rights, anything that you say until you are is inadmissible in a court of law. So if you haven't been Mirandized and you say, I did it, man, I set that bomb off, it was fun, cannot admit that in a court of law if you haven't gotten your Miranda rights. Now, there is an exception, and we're actually using that exception at this very moment with this guy we captured last night. There is an exception to the law that if there is an immediate threat, or if we believe there's an immediate threat, then we can ask them questions without Mirandizing them, and that can be used in a court of law. And that's actually what's happening. Now, in that circumstance, the minute you ask your first question, that starts to fade. You can't do it forever if they're not an enemy combatant. Typically, we think it's about 48 hours because it's all about an immediate threat. It's like, okay, we know that there's another bomb out there somewhere. We need you to tell us where it is. So they can do that. But that fades. Sooner or later, if it's 48 hours later and the bomb hasn't gone off, well, we're really not in an immediate threat situation. So you better read him his rights at that point, because anything he says beyond that, if you haven't Mirandized him, you can't use it in court.
What do you suggest we do?
So, well, I think they're probably doing it the right way right now. My inclination is always to err on the side of protecting a defendant's rights. I think that Lindsey Graham, what upset me about Lindsey Graham is this guy has spent the past number of weeks arguing of the sanctity of the Second Amendment, which he's completely entitled to do. He is. I may disagree with him with some of the legislation that was proposed if it did violate the Second Amendment, but hey, I can respect, as I say in the article, anybody who stands up for the Constitution, right? But for him to do that and then turn around last night and want to deny this guy his rights just struck me as unbelievable.
Which is why I think there's a huge split in the party. The Republican Party is really divided in two right now, or divided in more, I would say, because you have all Republicans seem to have this thing that they're for less government, Constitution, but then there's this side that I think is the neoconservative side.
Right.
When it comes to issues like these, they are not for the Constitution. They are not for less government. And even on the gay marriage issue, how could you say that you're for less government, less intrusion of government into our lives, and then say that we need a federal law banning gay marriage?
No disagreement.
So that's why I think the people who like myself, who are really on the side of less government, are in complete disagreement with these types of people.
I think that's right. Listen, I did something shocking a few weeks ago. I wrote a column congratulating Rand Paul.
Sure.
I loved his filibuster. I thought it was awesome what he did.
I think a lot of people on the left. Yeah. There was actually an article recently that my dad told me about that I thought was a good comparison. They said that Rand Paul is like the Willie Nelson of the Senate right now, because he could bring together like the hippies and the potheads, and then also the people who are conservative.
On some issues.
On this, he certainly.
I'm not a big fan of Rand Paul.
No, I get that,
but I liked what he did, but what I liked about it.
But why were there no Democrats there with him? Why was there no anti-war Democrats?
I agree with you. I absolutely agree with you.
And just to call this a silly issue, like they were saying, it's not silly, because we're not saying that the president is going to go around and ordering drone strikes on us right now if we disagree with what he's saying. but you should not give someone power that they could use, because the next person who might come in there who's not President Obama could completely abuse that in a different way.
And to me, the real problem was he had asked the Attorney General a very direct question. And I thought he was entitled to an answer to that question. And when it was the Attorney General's unwillingness to answer that question directly that set him off on this endeavor. I loved that he actually conducted a filibuster as opposed to the way it's done now. And two, it worked. The Attorney General ended up writing him a letter answering his direct question.
Sure.
So kudos to him.
And the interesting part about the filibuster, I was tuning in every few minutes.
Right.
He still sounded pretty coherent throughout the entire thing.
Well, he didn't do it. Listen, in the old days, they would go for days. He went
Yeah.
for hours. So
I still wouldn't be able to do it for how
Sure
long?
you
did
would.
7 hours or whatever it was?
you could do it.
I don't know. We've been here an hour, believe it or not.
I could
talking,
go
and
for another
it,
6.
It doesn't feel like we have. So wrapping up things, what are you going to be working on in the future? What do you have coming up?
Who knows? Always the column. Lots of television, lots of radio, lots of work over at Sirius, I hope, now that
Sure.
I'm part of that family.
Are we going to see a Rick Unger show on TV or radio in the future?
I think radio is probably more likely. I do.
I would love to see it. Because as I said, I think you're one of the few guys. A lot of people on radio love to say that they're open to debate. They like to discuss issues with the other side. And behind the scenes, I don't believe it a lot of the time when I meet them, because they like to just congregate with groups who think like themselves. And I could tell that you are not that type
No,
of
the
guy.
discussion is the fun part.
It should be.
I don't know why anybody wouldn't want to do
Because
that.
I think
Who goes into politics if you don't like to argue?
Because I think
know?
that people, it's just this culture of people on the right that we have to hate the left and that they're our enemy,
silly.
and people on the left see it the same way. And I just don't. I see people overseas, as we were talking about, who would bomb us
Right.
as our enemy.
Right.
I don't see people of a politically different view of the world than me. That's what makes our country great, because if you go to these other countries, there's political the political
You're not allowed
opponents
to do it.
But the
Right.
political opponents are killing each
Right.
other. We're not doing that in this country.
Anytime the word hate comes into it, you know that there's something wrong. And I got to tell you, I've written articles that tick off the progressives, and they can be just as ugly as the right wingers.
Of
you
course.
know? This whole hate thing is just way out of control here. It's not about hate just because I disagree with you. I don't hate Lindsey Graham. I've never met Lindsey Graham. How could I possibly hate him?
I agree.
You know, and from what I've been told, by the way, he's a really nice guy.
And if there's no bipartisanship, even just us having discussions like this, we're never going to get anywhere as a country. It's just going to be two completely divided sides. And that's kind of what we're seeing right now, the way the country stands.
Sure.
I mean,
Although it's always been that way, you know. I mean, this is also important for people to remember. Everybody thinks that it's this new terrible thing. Listen, back in the days of the Civil War or following it, man, they used to cane each other in Congress when they were on opposite sides. They wouldn't just yell at each other. They would pick up their canes and beat the crap out of each other.
I'm too young to remember everything about this era, but people do talk about
I remember that era back in the 1800s.
No, not that era, but I'm saying people do, really glorify the Clinton era as a time where there was more bipartisanship as opposed to now.
Good heavens. Are you kidding? Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton?
But when you see Bill Clinton speak, he still says things like, we reform welfare, and that was really more the Republicans than him, but he did cave into some of these demands.
He did, but that was politics. I mean, Clinton's genius was triangulation. Clinton became a Republican, known as a Democrat, and it worked really well. It did. But, oh gosh, I mean, go to the first term of the Clinton administration. There wasn't a whole heck of a lot of bipartisanship going on. And the rhetoric was just as ugly then. The difference is that in Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich of that time, you had two pragmatic politicians who came to understand, after trying to beat each other to death, that there was only one way forward, and that was to work it out.
Sure.
We can't seem to get to that point today where the leaders begin to I have to say, I think Barack Obama's figured it out. I haven't seen it quite yet. And again, to be fair, I think John Boehner's figured it out. John Boehner has special problems that aren't of his doing. But because of those special problems, they can't get to that same thing where instead of just trying to beat each other to death, they kind of go, hey, we might as well do this together because there ain't any other way to go. There are things happening today in the country and people sitting in the Congress that are preventing that to happen. I think, progressives have a tendency to be too tough on John Boehner. And listen, I've written stuff about him where I've been tough on him. I think he wants to make a deal. I think he wants to be reasonable. I think that's who he is. And I think the same about the president. I really do. There are some things that Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich didn't have to deal with in their time.
Sure.
So,
is there any
changed.
more cartoons in the future for Rick Ungar?
Actually, there is one, but it's not one that I created, but it is one that I did executive produce that will start this fall on Disney. It's Pac-Man.
Oh, wow.
We
so
did
just based
Pac-Man.
off the video game?
Yeah, we did it with Bandai Toys, Namco Bandai Toys, who own it. And my good friend Avi Arad, if any of you Marvel geeks out there know that Avi is the producer of all the Spider-Man movies, and Avi and I produced a new Pac-Man animated series.
That's going to be awesome. So looking forward to that. It's been a great show with you, Rick.
Been fun.
If anybody wants to check us out who's new to the podcast and just checking it out because they're a fan of Rick's, we're on Facebook, facebook.com/Ian Scotto Podcast. Twitter, we're at Scotto Podcast. And had a great discussion with you. I love speaking with you, Rick.
Let's do it next Saturday.
We'll definitely do it again in the future. I'm looking forward to having you on again.
All right, man. Thanks for having me.